The day that Ian Nethercott's destroyer was lost, 30 other ships were sunk. But still, the operation continued without interruption, and the Navy, aided now by over 600 small civilian craft, carried another 64,000 men away to safety.
We went, queued up for to get on the boats the next day, and a destroyer pulled in, and the skipper or someone on the bridge shouting, "On as quick as you can, jump lads, jump!" We jumped in, and the sailors were grabbing us and pulling us in. And it pulled out, and then the bomber came along, and he dropped his bombs. And it straddled the back of the boat, and the back of the ship lifted up. And the water came over, but we got away all right.
After 4 days waiting without food or shelter, Martin McLean was finally crossing the English Channel.
Landed in a port, and I shouted up to the man, "What place is this, mate?" He says, "Dover, mate, this is Dover." I couldn't believe it.
The next thing I remember was waking up, and I'm certain it was at New Haven, and along came a Salvation Army nurse with a trolley, and she gave me a lovely hot mug of tea and a cigarette.
They laid me on the jetty at Dover, and I was sent to some crummy hospital at the back there in Kent. It was me thinking I was going to have a lovely time in a civilian hospital with pretty nurses, and I landed up in Gillingham with these monkey-faced sods in the Navy, you know, the sick bay tiffies, you know, the cruelest men out.
Home. His sister was around saying, "Fred's home." Oh, I couldn't describe the joy I felt. And when I went down to his mother's, we just hugged each other. And he hadn't had a shave, he wasn't washed, he was hungry. He'd had nothing to eat hardly but a lorry load of salmon they'd found on the way that had been abandoned. Never faced salmon afterwards.
The evacuation had gone better than anyone had dared to hope. Almost all the stranded British soldiers were rescued, along with 80,000 French troops. Relief at the return of so many men temporarily masked what had been the most crushing humiliation in the history of the British Army.
It was a massive defeat. It was a retreat, but it was turned into the most marvellous, heart-stirring miracle, really.
This is the most magnificent sight of a generation. This is the army under its magnificent leaders. They have come back from a terrible and bitter battle, but still in their tired and half-closed eyes is mirrored the spirit and cause for which they fight. That has not gone. That can never be taken away from them.
Churchill seized the moment, speaking to the world in defiant tones.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
We thought him a saviour. He was a bulldog of a man, he had some funny ways, but when he said we'll fight them on the beaches, great. We'll fight them on here and there, everywhere. That done the troops and the world and the country wonders.
Despite the odds against us, he made us believe that we could actually win, that we were unconquerable. And he was asked in the dire moment after the collapse of France and Dunkirk, when we really stood alone, and in that moment of enormous peril, he was asked if our paintings from the National Gallery should be sent to Canada for safety. And he said, no, no. They should be hidden in caves and cellars. We are going to beat them.
But Lord Halifax was not so sure. He made contingency plans in case Churchill's bravado, as he called it, should fail. Behind the Prime Minister's back, the Foreign Office sent a message to Germany via a Swedish diplomat, keeping open the option of peace talks. Churchill quickly learned of the exchange and was furious. He ordered his ministers to have no such conversations with foreign diplomats, and instead to spread confidence in Britain's ultimate victory at all times. Not every British soldier was home. Peter Vaux was still on the run in German-occupied France. With 2 comrades from his abandoned tank, he was hiding in an old monastery.
We realized that we were quite close to the River Somme, and if we could only get there and get across, there would be French troops the other side. So we decided to walk to the Somme. And we got into marshes, and we got into bogs, and it was ghastly. And we were hungry and exhausted and cold, and from time to time we saw Germans and heard German voices. And we sloshed about in these marshes, and we couldn't get anywhere near the river, which is what we wanted to do. And it was at that point that the Major said, I don't know, we may have to give ourselves up. And I said, not yet. And the corporal said, not me, sir.
The men returned to the monastery. Local French villagers were afraid to help them, but a refugee from Belgium, Monsieur Gilly, offered to show Peter Vaux the best place to cross the river. Vaux, in borrowed clothes, posed as a refugee himself.
We passed 2 or 3 little positions of Germans until we got right down almost to the river bank. You could see the river bank. And there was a German position there with a sergeant major, and they had a machine gun. And he said, well, let's have a look at your identity card. So Gilly produced his identity card. Perfectly in order, of course. And then he turned to me and said, and yours? And this Belgian was superb. He turned on him like a tiger. He said, as he told me afterwards, he said, you are a revolting race. Here is this boy, only speaks Flemish, parents killed by your horrible aeroplanes, walked all the way from Belgium, and you ask him for an identity card? The German was quite shattered. He said, go on, get away, the pair of you. So we went away. But when I was asked for my identity card, my heart stood still.
Peter Vaux rejoined his companions in the monastery. The 3 fugitives decided to wait until late that night and then try to swim across the river under the cover of darkness.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Churchill's words were broadcast in the United States. Journalist Whitelaw Reid listened alongside former President Herbert Hoover.
I was very concerned at the time, of course, about Britain, and I was thrilled by Churchill's words. It was a terrific speech, I think, for rallying the forces and rallying people around the world to the English cause. But at that same time, Herbert Hoover was in the household. He at last was sort of glum about it, thinking that it was too late, and it was too late for America to do anything. And I just got a very negative feeling about his reaction to it all.
Anyone in America who wanted to help Britain in 1940 had to contend with the powerful isolationist movement. Under the banner of America First, tens of thousands attended rallies demanding their country's absolute neutrality.
The mainstream of isolationism is the America First Committee, one of the most powerful mass movements the U.S. has ever seen. Folk hero Charles Lindbergh symbolizes its grassroots nature. Along with one-time Governor Alfalfa Bill Murray and Montana's Senator Burton Wheeler, he advocates the theory that the policy of isolation is as valid in 1940 as it was in 1776.
France has now been defeated, and despite the propaganda and confusion, it is now obvious that England is losing more. I believe this is realized even by the British government. But they have one last desperate plan remaining. They hope that they may be able to persuade us to send another American expeditionary force to Europe.
I think they believed in a fortress America, that we could be strong and stay on our own. And I thought that America should come of age, and that we had to become involved and take responsibility for what was going on.
There was another reason why Washington did not rush to Britain's aid. Many there were concerned about Winston Churchill's reputation as a heavy drinker. Roosevelt reportedly told his cabinet, "I suppose Churchill is the best man that England has, even if he is drunk half the time. He's very unreliable when under the influence of drink." Churchill's enemies in London shared the same anxiety. They believed that the Prime Minister's war policy was driven by bravado, Dutch courage. Downing Street Secretary Marion Holmes saw Churchill every day.
Oh yes, he was a regular drinker. He drank quite a bit of brandy but after a huge meal. He drank with food. That was the point. I remember him being served lunch at Chequers. He was very tired and he was working from bed and decided to have lunch in bed. Sardines, which he loved. And there were two carafes on the tray. One had whiskey in it and one had water. And I watched him pour his whiskey onto his sardines, and the water was still in the other carafe. And so I felt this, I've got to intervene here and mention it. He said, "Oh, I must be going dotty," you know. But he never drank to the point of being the worse for wear. And I remember him once saying, "I've taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me." And that really summed it up.
Peter Vaux and his two comrades waited for night to fall before making their escape across the River Somme. One of them left a memento of his time hiding in the old monastery buildings.
That was Corporal Burrows. He came from Wiltshire, and he'd been my driver for a long time. You know, with the tank, your driver and you are very, very close indeed. The rank doesn't enter into it, really. That night we did indeed go down to the river bank. The sergeant major wasn't there, but there were patrols up and down. And we waited and watched them, and we realized there was actually a gap of 10 minutes between the time people went up and down. So we stripped off all our clothes and did them up in a bundle, which the major swam across with. all forgotten one thing, and that was we hadn't eaten now for nearly a week, and we were absolutely exhausted, and I suppose the modern expression would be we were also stressed out. There was no doubt about it, and everything went wrong. The Major did get across.
Peter Vaux was helped by French soldiers and finally made his way home to Britain. Soon afterwards, Paris fell, and the French government opened peace talks with Adolf Hitler. Residents of England's southern coast expected to be the next target.
We knew after the defeat of our army, the invasion from Germany was coming. We'd wake up in the mornings and quite expect to see German troops stalking the town. The population of Dover was 40,000, it dropped to 18,000 at that time. The town was deserted. But Dover was then becoming a fortress. Anti-aircraft batteries, the seafront was barbed-wired. They was erecting these concrete pillboxes overnight.
All the hotels at the front at Westcliff had been taken over by the Navy, and the barbed wire was going up all along there. But at that time, you saw a lot of the Navy about it. Well, you know, there's somebody here. We're not going to be left unguarded, as it were, if something happens.
For 150 years, Britain's navy had dominated the oceans of the world. But Dunkirk showed that her warships were vulnerable to air power. Then on the 17th of June, German bombers sank the troop ship Lancastria, killing 4,000 men. For the Royal Navy, it was the greatest single disaster of the war so far. The Prime Minister was shattered by the news.
I had seen him suffused in grief at the loss, and he cried. And it takes a very great man, I think, to show his emotions. He was very endearing in a way.
With warships on his mind, Churchill cabled President Roosevelt, pleading with him to send Britain 50 old American destroyers kept in storage by the U.S. Navy.
Mr. President, I must tell you that in the long history of the world, this is a thing to do now.
But Roosevelt refused, saying that Congress and public opinion would still not allow such direct intervention in a foreign war. Meanwhile, Roosevelt's generals carried out secret defense talks with the Canadian government. Talks aimed at bringing the Royal Navy under joint U.S.-Canadian control the moment Britain fell. Many influential Americans were by now thinking of a future without an independent Britain. A top Nazi businessman threw a party at one of New York's finest hotels. Some of the most powerful figures in American industry attended, including executives from General Motors and Henry Ford's son, Edsel. The Nazis' guests were wined and dined, and told to expect rich business opportunities in Hitler's new Europe. Convinced that Britain would fall at any moment, Whitelaw Reid hurried across the Atlantic to cover the story for his family's newspaper.
I concluded that the invasion of Britain, which I thought was imminent, was going to be the biggest story since the birth of Christ, and I wanted to be in on it and helping. And I didn't get there for quite a while, so I was very relieved on arriving to find that England was still in one piece.
Britain was not only in one piece. Reid soon found that some of its people had been infected with their prime minister's bravado.
The customs official seemed totally confident that all would be well, and he said he had taken his daughter in hand and he had shown her how to fit a broom handle into the end of a bottle. And then he broke off the big end of the bottle and he said, if any bloody Nazi comes in my house, he's going to get that right in the face. Well, I thought it was unreal. I thought Britain didn't have the means to defend itself at that point, and they were in a kind of fool's paradise. I know at one point I was talking to a woman and she said she'd put a mattress on top of her tower so if she was going to be hit by a bomb, it would bounce off.
For Americans already living in Britain, war dominated every aspect of life.
The spring was glorious. I remember having lunch in Chelsea with a dear friend of mine and talking about how beautiful the window boxes were. And I was carrying on about the fantastic colors. They were all so bright and garish and beautiful and heavenly and joyous. And he took me and he said, come, I'll show you another kind. And we walked around a corner, and there were two window boxes in a lovely little Chelsea house that had nothing but the darkest flowers, a kind of a black tulip and a very purple pansy, and just as dark as they could be. And he said, the woman who lives in this house, her husband, was killed on an aircraft carrier that was sunk, and she said that her window boxes will always be in mourning for him.
As London's parks replaced flower beds with barrage balloons, Ambassador Kennedy decided that it was time to send his family and much of his staff home to safety.
Joe said at breakfast, he said, I'm going to send you home. And my feelings were absolutely torn because as much as I missed my family, I wanted to stay in England, desperately wanted to stay. A lot of the English drivers were in the garden and they were talking in their wonderful Cockney. I heard one of the drivers say, Cor blimey, the Uns have got to Paris. And I just burst into tears, you know. It had to happen. I mean, you knew it was going to. But it just seemed like such a dreadful moment to think that the Germans were in Paris.
Peter Vaux, now back home, found that despite the odds against Britain, his own family had been infected with some of Churchill's defiance.
My father said to me, can you get me a pistol? And I did. And he was an elderly man, of course, but they lived in Paynton. They were very close to the beach. He had a sort of feeling that if a German arrived on the beach, he could get one. And Churchill, remember, did say, one of his speeches, you can always take one with you. And that would be exactly my father's attitude. He wanted that pistol, and I got him one.
Peter Vaux's regiment was ordered to the south coast to resist the expected invasion. His first job was to find places where tanks and their crews could be based. Most people were eager to help, but not all.
In many cases, it was the people who got quite a lot to lose. Some of them would say, what's the good? Look what they've done in France. There you won't hold them up. They'll be in here in no time. I don't want my house spoiled. But the thing that I always remember it was the little people, the farm labourers, the little farmer, and the people in the terraced houses, who were so marvellous. They had so little to give, and they gave it so readily.
Here are some factory workers who have organised their own defence corps and drill in their lunch hour. All over the country.
Britain's volunteer army had plenty of fighting spirit, but few modern weapons.
I found that men were sitting up nights making fishing poles, and instead of a hook, they put a wad of gunpowder on it. And the idea was they would be hiding in holes every 100 yards or so. And when a tank came rumbling by, caught in the trap, they would cast the gunpowder on the top of the tank and explode it. And that is how primitive some of the defenses in England were at that time.
The cables coming into Downing Street from Washington and Ottawa infuriated Churchill. North America's leaders seemed obsessed with what would happen to the Royal Navy once Britain lost the war. Churchill wanted them to help him win it, or at least to help him survive an anxious summer. But the military situation kept getting worse. Italy had declared war on Germany's side, and France had just accepted humiliating peace terms. Churchill's latest fear was that Hitler would seize the powerful French Navy, thus threatening Britain's control of the English Channel and clearing a way for the invasion of Britain. It was a moment for decisive action. At the end of June, Churchill ordered his admirals to seize all French ships in British ports, and he sent a powerful force to demand the surrender of the main French battle fleet in the North African port of Oran. Aboard the British battleship HMS Resolution was 18-year-old sailor Sam Patience.
We didn't know until the actual sailing that we were going out to engage the French fleet who were trying to get to Brest or whatever, German-occupied France. And we were told the purpose was to go out and stop them from getting it.
The French were given the option of neutralizing or scuttling their warships. Negotiations dragged on, but the result was deadlock. The British admirals were reluctant to open fire on men who had so recently been their allies, but Churchill insisted, ordering his navy to settle the matter quickly.
We just opened fire on them. Noise shattering. The ship seemed to shake, you know. You got a full salvo of 8 15-inch guns firing. That's a lot. And 6-inch batteries as well, all out one side.
The French warships, tied up at the docks and unable to maneuver, didn't stand a chance. Within minutes, over 1,300 French sailors were dead, and many more were wounded.
Oh, there was a lot of damage done. The quayside was piled with bodies, which we did with our shelling. You were never given, you know, a sort of question as to whether it was right or wrong. As far as you was concerned, you was just doing your job. The fleet had to be stopped from going over to the Germans. I didn't feel ashamed about doing it at all. It was a question of them or us.
Within days, Churchill had put the better part of the French Navy beyond Hitler's reach. Some called it savage, treacherous even. But at a critical moment in the war, it swung the balance of naval power back Britain's way.
When we heard this business of Oran, we felt it was an awful thing because we'd, after all, I remember thinking at the time we'd seen the French sailors with the red pom-poms on their white hats at Cherbourg when we first landed. It seemed an awful thing to be sinking their ships. But we did understand it, at least we did in the regiment. We understood that it was necessary.
Churchill told Parliament that his action at Oran proved once and for all that his government would never make peace. And for the first time since becoming Prime Minister, he was acclaimed from all sides of the House of Commons. The attack on Oran had a profound impact in America, too. After weeks of humiliation for the British cause, here suddenly was proof that Britain still had teeth. One New York newspaper editor wrote,
"I'm for sending weapons to England, so long as it's run by a Churchill who will fight."
President Roosevelt later said that Oran made him believe that the war in Europe might not end in 1940 after all. And from July, his policy to Britain took a much more positive line. Realizing that peace was now out of the question, Hitler launched a new offensive, In mid-July, he ordered the Luftwaffe to take control of the English Channel and close it to all British shipping.
Every day, every hour, British convoys sail the seas, braving the perils of Nazi air raiders, and here comes a formation bent on challenging our supremacy on the sea. And it's a miss.
I used to stand on the top of the Western Heights and watch the bombing of the convoys, and I waved my fist up in the air. The German bastards was the word I used. My old mum said, "What did I hear you say, Frank?" She said, "I've never heard you swear before." She said, "Don't you ever say that again." I said, "Well, that's what everybody's calling them, Mum."
British fighter squadrons took to the air to protect the Channel convoys. The pilots were guided into battle by RAF ground controllers, assisted by young technicians from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, like 20-year-old Edith Heap.
They had furious battles over the convoys. We used to hear them on the RT, and it was like a running commentary. You said, "Look out, there's somebody on your tail." We could hear all that. And they say, "Oh, so-and-so's been shot down. You know, there's a plane going down, there's a parachute, or there isn't one." So you knew exactly what was happening. And the girls in the radio cabins could actually say, "Oh, look out, there's somebody behind you, you know, do watch it." And of course they couldn't hear what they were saying because they weren't in actual contact with them. But it was very intense. And we also heard all the language that they did, because you swear in battle. You know, buggers and bloodies and four-letter words and all sorts of things, I mean, which you're going to say when you're being attacked, aren't you? And somebody got very uptight about girls hearing all this language. Well, we weren't concerned with that. A, we didn't know what it meant. B, we didn't care about that. We only cared about our pilots.
A flotilla of destroyers steamed into view, patrolling the seas against possible invaders. Suddenly, a big flight of German dive bombers was reported. Patrolling RAF fighters hurtled to intercept them. In the battle which followed, 9 Nazis were shot down. Really, I suppose it was one of the most exciting periods of my life to watch these dogfights. We could hear the screech of the German dive bombers in the Channel, the explosions. It was flying at rooftop level. You could see the pilots sitting in them, the markings on the planes. Hear the cannon shell blazing into one another.
Sometimes they got stuck. They couldn't get out, you know, because of either the lid jammed, the cockpit cover jammed, or there was fire. Now, fire was the worst thing because they got terribly burnt. And then that was when they used to scream, of course. The screaming was really terrible. And of course, an awful lot of them went to hospital with these burns. Some of them pulled through and some didn't.
In July, the RAF lost 110 fighters and shot down 140 German planes. Hitler's attempt to dominate the Channel was being resisted, but only just. Whitelaw Reid traveled to Dover to cover the story for his newspaper and prepare for the expected invasion.
Well, it was Hitler weather most of the time that summer, you know, and the skies were bright blue, and you would see the planes high in the sky. I'd been asked down for the weekend by Secretary of State for War Eden at the time, and I spent Saturday in their front yard with their children, shooting bows and arrows and watching an occasional a German fighter come streaking across the sky. So it was a nervous time, and as a result, a lot of people in Dover started living in the cliffs. I remember the bombing of the Grand Hotel because I was up the street a little ways, and I heard things and got myself in the doorway of a shop, and there was a great thunderous clap, which must have been the bombs hitting the Grand Hotel, I guess, and everything shook around me. I hoped that the building wouldn't collapse. When I came out, why, a lot of the glass looked like sort of new fallen snow in the street. And I went back to the hotel, and one wing was in rubble.
Many of the American reporters in Dover began to feel an affinity to the British people in this, their darkest hour. Witnessing the horrors of war firsthand led Whitelaw Reid to conclude that American neutrality must end.
The next day, I was going out to Shakespeare Cliff to see some of the dogfights overhead, and all of a sudden there was a terrible screech. We went out to explore the beach, and one of the things I found on the beach was an old man who'd been too close to a blast, and he'd been decapitated. His head was lying close by, and his dog lay by his side. And it was a sad bit of evidence of the damage that was being done. It seemed that the world was on fire and that we ought to do something about it. That Hitler was an evil that had to be eliminated somehow. So progressively, I came to that kind of thinking myself.
American writer Ben Robertson, one of Whitelaw Reid's colleagues on the Dover Cliffs, later wrote about his feelings at this moment.
Those were wonderful days in every way. I lost my sense of personal fear because I saw that what happened to me did not matter. We counted as individuals only as we took our place in the procession of history. It was not we who counted. It was what we stood for. And I knew now for what I was standing. I was for freedom. I realized that good can often come from death. I understood Valley Forge and Gettysburg at Dover.
Reports from England began to turn American opinion. Pressure mounted to send substantial aid. But time was running out. From just across the Channel, the Germans were planning the biggest air attack in history. The young fighter pilots of the Royal Air Force would soon be tested as never before.
The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit upland.
Finest Hour, The Battle of Britain, was made possible by contributions to your PBS stations from viewers like you. Thank you.